Okay, first of all, hello and welcome. Bill Shea and Bob Krawinski here with Veterans for Peace and a talk titled Beyond Militarism, Where Do We Go From Here? To celebrate Martin Luther King Day in 2021. And for the record, Bill has served in the U.S. Marine Corps. I've served in the U.S. Navy. For Veterans for Peace, you could say it's a group of veterans who think that there's got to be a better way to solve conflicts all the time than running off to war, especially wars that are started and encouraged by non-veterans. One quote we like to use is President Dwight Eisenhower, who was also the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II on D-Day. And he stated, "I hate war only as a soldier who has lived it can, only as one who has seen its brutality and its stupidity." And he had another short quote saying, "The only way to win the next world war is to prevent it." We're not a traditional veterans group. We work to create a world where there are no veterans of war. And some of our members nationwide include Vietnam prisoners of war, Congressional Medal of Honor awardees. Some members are pure pacifists. Others would fight if there was a real threat to our country, such as in World War II. Some of our chapter projects are Arlington, Michigan. For those of you living in the Ann Arbor area, you might have seen us out in Veterans Park on Veterans Day. We have Arlington, Michigan, one grave marker for every Michigan soldier killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Also, we do these Martin Luther King Day talks on militarism, and besides this one, we'll be giving one at Eastern Michigan University and the University of Michigan. We're also going into full disclosure recruiting program. This is reaching out to young people thinking about joining the military with asking them questions that they'll never hear from a recruiter, such as, are you willing to follow orders without questions, or could you kill a person? So moving on, one final thing I'll touch on locally, we have a peace scholarship program. A number of years ago, we thought, what a better way to create a peaceful world than train and educate more people about peace and conflict resolution. We started in 2007. We have an annual John Lennon birthday benefit at the Ark for a fundraiser. And since 2007, we've given away $27,000. If you're a college student in a peace studies or conflict resolution course study, please apply for a scholarship. There's no deadline. You don't have to be a veteran. And go to vfp93.org and click on Peace Scholarships, and we'll put that webpage out at the very end too on a slide. And moving on then, why the title of the talk, Beyond Militarism, Where Do We Go From Here? Well, first of all, what is militarism? There's a number of definitions, but simply it could be a belief of government or people that a country should maintain a strong military capability and not be afraid to use it to defend or promote national interests. Another definition would be an ideology which claims that the military is the foundation of a society's security and therefore its most important aspect. And third, it could be the glorification or prevalence of military spirit, attitudes, or other feelings in a nation. In the United States, there's been concerns about militarism ever since the founding of the country. In the late 1700s, there was a suspicion of standing militaries in the new country. And Eldridge Gerry, a delegate to the American Constitutional Convention, wrote that standing armies in a time of peace are inconsistent with the principles of a republic-based government, dangerous to the liberties of a free people, and generally converted into destructive engines for established despotism. James Madison in June 1787 said, "In a time of actual war, great discretionary powers are constantly given to the executive magistrates," meaning the president. "The means of defense against foreign danger have been always the instruments of tyranny at home." And the people back then in the late 1700s had seen much war going on all in Europe and then over in our country, and they decided to create this government with an executive, judicial, and legislative branches with military operations strictly under civilian control. But over time, exceptions began to crop up to this civilian control too. For one, there's the Insurrection Act of 1807, which is a federal law that empowers the president to deploy U.S. military and federalized National Guard troops within the United States in particular circumstances, such as to suppress civil disorder, insurrection, and rebellion. It's rarely used, but in the past 6 months, we've seen the threatened use of the act by the Trump administration against peaceful protesters. We've seen Trump supporters wanting to use the act to keep Mr. Trump in office. And finally, the act was used against Trump supporters who stormed the Capitol. Another law that deals with the militarization is the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. It's sort of a check on parts of the Insurrection Act, as it prohibits troops from engaging in domestic law enforcement activities unless they do so pursuant to a lawful authority. And there's been a gradual loosening control on going to war. The Constitution states that only Congress can take the country into a war, a process, though, that was last used in December 1941. Now presidents bypass the Constitution for foreign country military action and instead have Congress pass a resolution, as with Vietnam, or since 2001, using authorizations for use of military force that we've seen in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and African military actions. Just to branch off here before we get to Bill, in modern times, the equipment the police have really has begun to contribute to militarism in the police force. In the past 30 years, we've seen a transfer of military equipment to civilian law enforcement agencies that is known as the 1033 program. In fact, this program legally requires the Department of Defense to make various items of equipment available to local law enforcement. It began in 1990 under President H.W. Bush and was expanded under the Clinton administration. And the 1033 programs allows the military to transfer property for the use in agencies and law enforcement, including counter-drug and counter-terrorism activities. As of 2020, 8,200 law enforcement agencies had participated in the program and transferred over $5.1 billion in military material from the Department of Defense to law enforcement agencies. The program had been criticized over the years by local media, by the Department of Defense Inspector General in 2003 and by the General Accounting Office, which found waste, fraud, and abuse in the program. President Obama signed an executive order in May 2015 limiting and prohibiting certain types of equipment to be given to law enforcement and required the return of large military equipment, a move that wasn't very popular with many law enforcement agencies. In Washtenaw County, an armored personnel vehicle was acquired but rarely used and was returned to the Department of Defense. The vehicle also had been on display at Touch a Truck events meant for children and families. However, in August 2017, President Trump rolled back the Obama executive order to again allow military items to be transferred to local law enforcement agencies. And just one more thing before we go to Bill, military strategies and intelligence structures in local law enforcement, just to touch on this. As police officers dress in the appearance of a military force, they increasingly look like members of an army prepared to go to war against unarmed civilians, escalating tensions between the police and peaceful protesters. And as of in a 2017 study, it showed that law enforcement agencies that use military equipment, officers, are more likely to display violent behavior and are more likely to kill the civilians that they are supposed to protect and serve. Indeed, the public is becoming accustomed to some local police officers looking like paramilitary forces. In the past few years, we've seen news footage of officers stationed at protests across the country clad in military gear, helmets, tactical dress, flak jackets, and so on, looking ready for combat, instead of the traditional uniforms worn by our public servants and is wholly unsuitable for normal policing. The streets of America are not some far-off battlefield, and our police are not an occupying force. The military function is to fight foreign enemies, which requires specialized weapons, gear, and tactics. Domestic police, however, are meant to protect individuals and uphold the rights of every American afforded under the Constitution, including the right to free speech and assemble. By definition, civil servants are not members of the military and are instead civilians charged by the government with the responsibility of protecting and serving the people in their moments of greatest need. These roles, however, can become dangerously mixed when a civilian police don military gear and carry specialized weapons. The militarization of many police departments now appears to be a means to threaten and menace the public rather than a tool to protect public safety in exceptional circumstances. Perhaps most troublingly, militarization has led to a cultural shift in law enforcement's view of its role in society from guardian to that of a warrior, and viewing people in the community sometimes not as a group to be protected, but instead as an opponent. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bill.
Okay, thanks, Bob. As early as December 11th, 1964, at his Nobel Prize lecture, King made the connection between injustice, poverty, and war, calling them the three evils of society. Over the course of the next 2 years, he steadily emphasized his anti-war sentiment, consistently pointing out how the war was connected to the struggle for civil rights. He stressed that the U.S. should stop the bombing in North Vietnam. He stated that the Vietnam War was unwinnable and accomplished nothing and must be stopped. When President Johnson said he planned to reduce anti-poverty spending to increase spending on the war, King stated that if that money could be used to put people to work, we would have dealt with the primary social problems of America: racism, poverty, and militarism. In January 1967, exhausted from his work on voters' registration, open housing, and the rising call for Black power, King spent a month in Jamaica working on his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? At that time, he saw an issue of Ramparts magazine entitled The Children of Vietnam. After viewing the photos in the magazine, he responded, "Nothing will ever taste any good for me until I do everything I can to end the war. It is destroying the soul of the nation." Some of the pictures. On January 3rd, 1967, King had been invited by the Nation Institute to deliver a Vietnam speech in late February in Los Angeles. In response to the Rampart magazine photos and the growing costs of the Vietnam War and its impact on existing social programs, on February 25th, 1967, King made his first anti-war speech in Los Angeles entitled The Casualties of the War in Vietnam. King declared, "Paramount are the physical casualties of war, napalm, death, handicaps, violence, but the stronger, more causal issues are the casualties of principle." Outlining these casualties, King declared, quote, "This war has played havoc with the destiny of the entire world. It has torn up the Geneva Agreement. It has seriously impaired the United Nations. It has exacerbated the hatred between continents and, worse still, between races. It has frustrated our development at home, telling our own underprivileged citizens that we place insatiable military demands above their critical needs. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on program for social uplift is approaching spiritual death." On April 4th, 1967, King gave another more controversial address at the Riverside Church in New York City. Entitled Beyond Vietnam, he articulated 7 reasons for his opposition to the war. 1. War is the enemy of the poor, both foreign and domestic. 2. Blacks and whites are allowed to fight together, but are restricted from living together in this country. 3. All social progress must be nonviolent. 4. We must speak for them, both friends and enemies. 5. Vietnam shows us a symptoms of a far deeper malady within American spirit, a lack of reconciliation. 6. Every nation must now develop an overriding loyalty to mankind in order to preserve the best in their individual societies. 7. Love is at the heart of working against these three evils: racism, poverty, and militarism. From these oppositions, he listed 5 things that must be done. 1. End all bombing in Vietnam. 2. Declare a ceasefire. 3. Curtail buildup in neighboring countries. 4. Realize the North must play a part in negotiation and unification. 5. Set date to remove all troops. These were bold words and counter to many in the U.S. From the media, the response to the speech did not go well. The NCAA was against it. Newspapers across the countries were also against it. Showing their glaring misunderstanding of the speech and the three evils, the New York Times observed that the speech was an attempt to, quote, fuse 2 public problems that are distinct and separate. By driving them together, Dr. King has done a disservice to both. It is clear that the Times just didn't get it. They didn't see the interconnectedness between social justice, poverty, and militarism. For much of the next year, King continually made the point that the three evils were all connected. In his address in the 11th Conference of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in August 16, 1967 in Atlanta, he gave the clearest and most passionate statement on the interconnectedness of the three evils and what must be done to diminish their impact. I'll play this for you. It's just a brief excerpt.
Now, when I say questioning the whole society, it means ultimately coming to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated. And if you will let me be a preacher just a little bit. One night a juror came to Jesus. And he wanted to know what he could do to be saved. Jesus didn't get bogged down on the kind of isolated approach of what you shouldn't do. Jesus didn't say, now, Nicodemus, you must stop lying. He didn't say, Nicodemus, now you must not commit adultery. He didn't say, now, Nicodemus, you must stop cheating if you're doing that. He didn't say, Nicodemus, you must stop drinking liquor if you're doing that excessively. He said something altogether different because Jesus realized something basic. That if a man will lie, he will steal. And if a man will steal, he will kill. So instead of just getting bogged down on one thing, Jesus looked at him and said, Nicodemus, you must be born again. In other words, your whole structure must be changed. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them and make them things. And therefore, they will exploit them and poor people generally, economically. And a nation that will exploit economically will have to have foreign investments and everything else, and it will have to use its military might to protect them. All of these problems are tied together. What I'm saying today is that we must go from this convention and say, America, you must be born again.
And I'm sure King would agree that a paramilitary police force one which includes the use of military hardware and regalia, and militaristic metaphors like war on drugs and against the poor and minorities, plus its ever-present bellicose ideology illustrated by the Black Lives Matter movement, that this paramilitary police force must be restructured around the original model of policing in the U.S. to serve and protect. I'm sure King would advocate that America's policing policies must be born again. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Bill. And Bob here again, and we're just going to have a little wrap up. And it'll involve an article, excerpts from an article by the Massachusetts American Civil Liberties Union titled Martin Luther King's Opposition to Militarism is a Call for Our Time. This was written last year. Dr. King's focus on militarism was based on traditional military conflicts such as the Vietnam War, but it's not a stretch to suggest that those same concerns around militarism extend to police militarism. King would surely recognize the warlike actions abroad inevitably lays the groundwork for warlike actions at home and the targeting of threats both foreign and domestic. In this way, the war on drugs and the war on terror have created a vague, nondescript enemy in a battlefield near you, rooted in fears that stem from racist and xenophobic ideas. We should not think of militarism as only law enforcement acquiring military-grade weapons, but also the acquiring of military strategies and intelligence structures. Beyond accumulating military materials such as weapons and vehicles, militarism has transformed the culture, organization, and operation of local policing. The culture of policing has changed when the local police fight wars against drugs and terror. The organization of policing has changed with the creation of SWAT teams and other tactical units with specialized training and weaponry. Finally, the operation of policing has changed with the use of military intelligence analysis methods used to address issues of community disruption and crime. Militarism within the police departments is a threat to our own civil liberties. In Beyond Vietnam, the same speech where King critiqued the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism, he makes the bold demand for people to put themselves at risk for the sake of peace. We are facing very dark and perilous times, and the threat of potentially unconquerable giant triplets loom large. Now is the time for people of conviction and valor to stand in opposition at whatever risk to themselves, to advance the cause of justice by resisting the spread of militarism with every fiber of our souls. The machinery of repression is always evolving, always being upgraded, and may have received a few new coats of paint since the 1790s when our country was founded, but the core remains the same. Just as King worked to dismantle the machine before us, we must do everything we can to hinder its insidious functions today. Even in death, King was not conquered. The brash militarism of the state is no match for the conviction of the soul. King's vision of resistance and hope lives in us today as a thing of everlasting potential. Justice, King teaches us, will not thrive on its own. It will only prevail if we have the will and the courage to work at it. In closing, what else can we do? Just three things here. People can support fact-based news reporting. There's a saying, first they came for the news media, after that, I don't know what happened. In these trying times, get your news from factual sources and support this work through financial contributions. Second, support groups financially and with your time too that promote and protect the Constitution of the United States, such as the ACLU, and organizations that insist we treat each other with the same such as Black Lives Matter, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and locally the Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice, and the local Poor People's Campaign. And third, very important, vote and also support candidates which causes you believe in. We talked about a lot here, but for more on Martin Luther King and militarism, Veterans for Peace, and the Veterans for Peace Chapter 93 Peace Scholarship Program, please visit our webpage, www.vfp93.org. And thanks for visiting today. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.